Morning and welcome everybody. This is the CPUC IRP Modeling Advisory Group webinar for reliability related to components of LSE Integrated Resource Plan Development for 2022, including results of the PRM study and Elcc study done by Energy Division staff and consultants. My name is Nathan Barsick, Program and Project Supervisor for CPUC Energy Division's Integrated Resource Planning section. Joined here by a host of Energy Division staff and consultants that have been working on this project. On the next slide, we're going to cover some quick notes about logistics and scope for the webinar. As usual, slides are available on our Events and Materials webpage. This webinar is being recorded, as you just heard. That recording will be posted in the coming days to the same spot on the webpage. There's four main objectives to today's webinar. The first is to promote stakeholder understanding of IRP reliability analysis that we're going to talk about. Second is to provide information to be used in LSE plan development to LSEs. Third is to gain feedback to inform future IRP reliability analyses. And the fourth is to provide an update on the overall schedule for IRP's inputs and assumptions development for this cycle of IRP. The third slide contains some housekeeping items that most of you are probably pretty familiar with at this point, but we'll refresh. So we invite clarifying questions in this webinar, which is going to cover quite a bit of technical content. We invite those questions at regular junctures that we'll try to make obvious throughout the webinar. I'm going to provide my usual caveat regarding advocacy. We are really looking for clarifying questions and things that promote understanding. And we'll ask you guys to minimize any points or statements regarding advocacy. Just in the interest of time, there's a lot of stuff that we have to get through, and we want to just make sure that everyone understands everything first. There are multiple ways to ask a question. Everyone is defaulted to mute right now, but the three ways are within the WebEx, you can raise your hand using the little hand function so that the host can see you. The second option is on the phone. You can dial 3 to trigger that raise your hand function. And if you can't use the audio, the third option is that you can type into the Q&A feature of the WebEx, and we'll see it and try to get to it, though we might not be able to get to it as quickly as we can the audio Q&As. Should time not permit attention to every question in the time that we've allotted here, or if you'd like to informally comment, we've provided our usual IRP data request email here at the bottom. A quick note on the agenda on the next slide. Like I said, it's pretty packed. The first item, intro and context, is me. I will only be boring you with that for the next few minutes. After that, we're going to get some background information on the studies themselves by our energy resource modeling teams, Patrick Young here in Energy Division. Next will be a description of the PRM study by Patrick, accompanied by Kevin Carden from Astrape. After that, we'll have our first Q&A. Next item would be a description of the results of the Elcc study by Aaron Burdick of E3 and IRP teams Neil Raffin from Energy Division. I'll have a Q&A after that as well. Next, we'll quickly cover the study conclusions that we think folks should be taking away. And after that, we'll actually have presentations from staff from 2 IOUs that we're pretty excited about. So PG&E and SCE have both dedicated modeling resources and staff to try to work with us in parallel to see if they can do their own reliability studies and see what they find out, see how they compare to what we're doing here. And we're very happy to have PG&E come present on its study and some of its results, and Edison to come present on its study methodology. We'll also have a Q&A after that. Next, we'll have a short item for the update on IRP's inputs and assumptions development schedule by IRP teams Ali Ashraghi, and then Neil will cover next steps at the end. Moving into context here, and I'm just going to try to connect some dots for everybody. The main point of this webinar is to promote stakeholder understanding of what we're doing, reliability analysis-wise, to inform reliability planning in IRP. This webinar is a follow-on to our April 7th MAG, addressing the early stages of a broad set of reliability updates that were to be conducted by IRP this cycle. We have been working over the last 3 months, and we want to be able to update you on some of that. There is one near-term use case, which is to provide LSEs what they need to plan, reliability-wise, for the individual IRPs that they're going to be filing on November 1st of this year. But there are multiple later use cases, which will build on what we're covering here, and be very important when they kind of materialize later on this cycle and in future IRP cycles. The first is updates to Resolve and Survem, so basically bettering our modeling inputs as they relate to reliability. The second is as part of our future IRP procurement program, which if you look at the February preferred system plan decision, is scheduled to be adopted about this time next year, including any need determinations made therein. So I'm not going to read through each of the items on the next slide. It's basically a exhaustive list of all the things that have happened since that early April MAG. The main point of this slide is to communicate that there's been a lot of activity in the last 3 months to tee up the LSEs for their filings and for the future use cases that I described a minute ago. The main item here is the June 15th ruling formalizing LSE filing requirements for their November 1st filings. That ruling discussed multiple staff level work products, which are also listed here. We're hoping that with this MAG and some data that's going to be released at the end of the month, which should be the last of it, LSEs will have all the ingredients that they need to develop their IRPs and do so on time. On slide 8, we want to note that this IRP cycle is unique, given how much more attention we're giving reliability planning, which I'm guessing that most people over the last 2 years since the events of August 2020 say is appropriate. We think so too. We provide here on the left a little bit of background to show kind of a progression of how IRP has been considering reliability, to the extent that that can be summed up in a handful of bullets for each cycle. You can see in the first IRP cycle in 2018, reliability was not as much of a focus, and maybe not as much as it should have been. We feel like we missed on some key assumptions, particularly imports, which I think are listed here, that drove some need. And moving into the 2019-2021 cycle, we saw it through the procurement track to kind of rectify what had happened about missing some of those assumptions like imports with the D19-1116 procurement order. But as it relates to actually reliability planning changes, we updated our assumptions about imports, about Elccs, and some other key drivers. And we did have 2 big procurement orders, but neither of which were directly linked to loss of load modeling, which we know a lot of parties would have liked to see. I will say that a lot of our modeling results, Resolve included, did point to levels of procurement consistent with what we saw in those 2 procurement orders, but we understand parties' concern about using stack analyses or kind of tools like that versus full-fledged loss of load studies to make need determinations. In the 2023 or 2022-2023 IRP cycle, reliability-wise, we have a chance to improve, and we want to take it. And that's what we're trying to show everyone here is what are we actually doing to improve. The right-hand side of the table shows a summary of some of the discrete opportunities that we see to improve on. We've listed PRM, thermal resource accounting, and ELCCs for a couple different use cases as kind of the marquee items. But it's not exhaustive, and maybe over the course of the next couple hours, taking what you learned back in April and what you're about to learn, you'll see what we're seeking to do to improve how IRP is characterizing reliability. I think moving to the next slide, I can have the pleasure of handing over to our energy resource modeling section's Patrick Young.
Morning, everyone. This is Patrick Young, Senior Analyst on the Energy Resource Modeling team of Energy Division. I'm going to summarize our approach to modeling system reliability in the 22-23 IRP cycle. So we are using the Strategic Energy and Risk Valuation model as the foundation for determining system need and counting resources to satisfy that need. As a reminder, Survem is a loss of load probability and production cost model licensed through Astropic Consulting. And Energy Division has used this model for several years now to inform various CPUC proceedings. So I believe most of you are familiar with this model. How are we going to be determining need? We are calculating system need and expressed as a total reliability need. We're counting that with perfect capacity megawatts. This total reliability need can be translated into perfect capacity or PCAP, PRM, above median gross peak demand. The PCAP PRM is different from an ICAP PRM, which is what most stakeholders in CPUC proceedings are familiar with. So I'm going to actually read this bullet to emphasize this difference. A PCAP-based approach means removing from the reserve margin an allowance for forced outages of firm resources and accrediting all resource types at their respective ELCC. In other words, their perfect capacity equivalent. And we're basing this on simulations that consider risk of outage, resource availability, and different resources, interaction with demand and other types of resources. From there, after determining the total reliability need, we calculate the marginal reliability need relative to that, and we're allocating that to LSEs based on their share of the Energy Commission's managed peak forecast. All resources in LSE's integrated resource plans, both firm and non-firm resources, will be counted with marginal ELCCs. Alongside this refreshed reliability approach, we're making changes to the resolve model as well to align with the Survem model. We're aligning the PRM and the ELCCs with LSE plan inputs, and we're using the PCAP, PRM, and ELCCs from the same Survem model in resolve. We're going to use the Survem model to develop the ELCC surface in resolve so that when resolve is building out resources in its capacity expansion simulation, it is counting reliability contribution in a consistent manner as what is relevant to Survem. We're also changing the surface from a solar and wind ELCC surface in resolve, because in the past, the interaction between solar and wind has been important to account for. Now we are in a little bit of a different world given the penetration levels of solar and wind and now storage, and the more important relationship to account for is the interaction between solar and storage. So we intend to update the resolve model to account for that interaction. Wind, as we see going forward, will be less impacted by the penetration levels of solar and storage. And in resolve, we intend to have separate wind ELCC curves basically to account for saturation effects of wind. In addition, like we are doing with the Survem model and developing ELCCs for LSE plan inputs, we will be modeling firm resource or counting firm resources and hydro in Resolve's PRM constraint using ELCCs. Okay, next slide. So Energy Division uses the loss of load probability modeling approach with Survem model across multiple proceedings. Now, not all proceedings will use the perfect capacity PRM approach that IRP is using, but the loss of load probability modeling approach and the accompanying data with it is going to be common across all of Energy Division's work, and it will allow us to relate different work products and leverage the extensive work it takes to develop a data set for loss of load probability models. The modeling data as used for the work, the modeling results that we're about to present is posted to the CPUC website to allow for parties to review and comment. And as a reminder, parties, the mechanism for feedback is during the regular IRP input and assumptions development process and periodic modeling advisory group meetings such as today. Next slide. So this slide recaps the recent Survem modeling updates we have done. These updates were completed in about May 2022, and they are applied in this PRM study that we are about to present the results for. We actually posted the results, I believe, last month. And now we're actually going to talk through them with stakeholders. Recent studies in the IRP proceeding, for example, the 2021 IRP Preferred System Plan, and also the RA proceedings, February 2022 LOLE and PRM study. Those use assumptions from the prior IRP cycle. So the results we're about to present are the first time we're discussing the results with these new Survem modeling updates. I'm going to try to quickly recap what the actual updates were. Previously, the weather years included in the Survem model were 1998 through 2017, and now we're adding 3 more model years, 2018, 19, and 20. And these weather years determine the distribution of load, wind, solar, and hydro hourly shapes. We've updated demand forecasts input to be the Energy Commission's adopted 2021 IPER demand forecasts. And the specific case we're using is the mid case. We have also updated the preferred system plan portfolio from Resolve. That is, Resolve was also updated to the 2021 IPER demand forecast with some updated resource costs and transmission zone limit inputs. And so the same preferred system plan configuration that was just adopted a few months ago was just refreshed, and that created a new portfolio to be input into Survem. There's a slight disconnect here since we're trying to do 2 things at once here. We're updating our reliability model inputs, but we haven't yet updated Resolve. But we need to work with some portfolio. So this is what we did. Another thing that we did in Survem is to collapse the PGE Bay and Valley regions into 1 PGE region. Previously, we had 4 subregions to cover the CAISO, the PG&E Bay and Valley, and then Edison's territory and San Diego Gas and Electric territory. And we found that the extra fidelity of having a Bay and a Valley region was not necessary. So we we've simplified the model somewhat by collapsing our model to just model the transmission constraints between PG&E, Edison, and San Diego, and that will represent CAISO in our model. Another simplification we made was to eliminate explicit modeling of neighbors outside CAISO. So instead, we have fixed import shapes, which were developed based on historical import patterns. And that's how we model transfers with neighbors for the CAISO in Survem. We've updated forced outage rates based on a refresh of data available from NERC. We've also somewhat relaxed transmission limits between the north and the south. And this is because in the course of reliability modeling, we may need to retire or add resources, and we don't want that to any constraint across the north and the south to distort our measure of system reliability need. Another improvement we did was to align the amount of fixed versus tracking solar. There was a disconnect between the resolve in Survem in terms of how much of the total solar capacity is fixed versus tracking. So we've aligned that. And the final change we've made is that we are modeling battery storage behind the meter battery storage strictly as a load modifier based on the shapes that are provided with the Energy Commission's 2021 IPER demand forecasts. Okay, next slide. I'll speak to a little bit of the high level of the study approach we're taking to calculate a planning reserve margin for use in establishing the total need for LSE's filing requirements. So as I've said a few slides ago, we're using a PCAP PRM or perfect capacity PRM. And I've already read this statement, but I'll repeat it one more time quickly because this is a new approach and is maybe unfamiliar to stakeholders. So a PCAP PRM means removing from the reserve margin an allowance for forced outages of firm resources. And we are calculating an ELCC for all resource types, that is their perfect capacity equivalent. And that will, in fact, reduce the PRM, as we will see later on in this slide deck. Now, the PCAP PRM is maybe unfamiliar to stakeholders. So we are going to also present an ICAP PRM, which is more familiar to stakeholders as information only. And this is just to be able to relate to the more familiar 15% ICAP PRM that everyone is familiar with from the resource adequacy proceeding. As was mentioned earlier before, by the end of July, staff will be providing all of the materials that stakeholders will need, or those LSEs that have that are required to file IRPs will be will have all of the information they need to develop their IRPs. So that includes the resource data template or RDT, along with the resource accreditation metrics, ELCCs by resource type that are calculated using this perfect capacity PRM paradigm. I'll leave it at that and hand it over to, well, do I have another slide? Yes, I do have another slide. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is just a high-level overview of the steps that we are taking to reliability planning using loss of load probability modeling, and I'll leave it to the next presenter, Kevin Carden from Astrape, to go into the details. But to start, the first step is an exhaustive effort to develop the model and the data development. To do robust loss of load probability modeling, we need to have a robust data set of a range of weather conditions. So as I said earlier, we are using the 1998 through 2020 weather conditions for to cover a broad range of diverse weather conditions, and also capturing some of the more extreme weather that has been occurring in recent years. We also need hourly shapes for the resources that are correlated with these different weather patterns. So we collect data on solar and wind production that has occurred in 1998 through 2020, as well as hydro shapes. And we put those all together in a model in order to have a good stochastic data set with which to do a loss of load probability modeling. But once we've developed the data, then we can actually run the model and establish what the total reliability need is using perfect capacity. And from there, we derive exactly how much perfect capacity or effective megawatts is needed to meet a reliability standard such as 1 day in 10 years or 0.1 days per year. And then to meet that reliability standard, we also calculate effective load carrying capability by resource type so that the resources that can count towards meeting that reliability need are all consistent because they're all calculated using the same data set and the same model. To cover this in a little bit more detail, I'm going to hand it over to Kevin Carden from Strape Consulting.
Thanks, Patrick. It was a good background discussion on the steps for reliability planning. I'm actually going to try to take a fairly high-level approach to explaining some of this. Obviously, there's a lot of technical detail in the material here. I do want to kind of give the big picture overview of a number of the steps and the methods that we use to translate the outputs of the reliability model to ultimately the resource plan that we end up with. So picking up where Patrick left off, looking at the total reliability need that we identify from the output of the Survem simulation runs. That TRN is expressed in megawatts, so we have a total capacity need. It could be effective megawatts. There are a number of different methods for calculating what that effective megawatts are, and I'll talk through those in a little bit more detail. But ultimately, we take that total reliability need in megawatts, divide by the peak demand, so the gross peak, -1 gives us our planning reserve margin. So that planning reserve margin will be the reserves that we need to meet the 1 day in 10 standard. Next slide. Okay, a couple of different ways of expressing the planning reserve margin. You're probably familiar with several of these. I'll try to provide some clarification on the application of different ones and why we recommend the perfect capacity method for this effort going forward. Most entities have historically used an installed capacity PRM to express the planning reserve margin. So the need using installed capacity, it maintains some of the reserves in the planning reserve margin for generator outages. So Patrick talked about several of the variables that affect the need for reserves, load variability, the need for ancillary services, forecast error, so forth. Those components, ultimately, we need to carry reserves for that. We also need to carry reserves for generator outages. But instead of expressing that in the PRM, we believe it's a more consistent, more fair method to account for that in the ELCC of every respective resource. Given that the installed capacity includes the reserves for the forced outages in the calculation, if you have a mix of resources, if I have some battery, some solar, some storage, some battery, solar, wind resources that are counted at their ELCC, counting the other resource, the conventional resources, the thermal resources at their installed capacity makes that comparison a little bit more challenging. The unforced capacity method attempts to resolve this. The basic premise behind that, use a heuristic that says the equivalent forced outage rate is a good proxy for the outage effect on the need for reserves. So a system that has 5% forced outage rate, we could bring down the capacity that we accredit by 5%, and that would be a UCAP PRM. So in a system that's all conventional, if we need to carry a 20% PRM to meet 1 in 10 under ICAP, it would be a 15% PRM under the UCAP method. Again, because we've got a mix of resources, and as we continue to expand the system, adding more solar, more battery, more wind resources, and the share of those resources that are counted at ELCC, to make all resources fungible, we believe that the perfect capacity method is more appropriate. So it's going to measure all resources against a perfect capacity equivalent resource. So all the forced outages, portfolio effects are going to be handled in the resource accreditation. Next slide. So I've already kind of hit on some of these points. The reason that we are recommending that we are using the perfect capacity method going forward is that it does provide a number of benefits, that it's reliable. We can meet the 1 day in 10 standard. It's efficient, fair, feasible, and durable. So the fact that we're treating all resources on the same basis against the same type of resource, against that perfect capacity resource, means that it's a fair standard. It's also durable in the sense that it's not going to be as volatile as you change the resource mix, as we have a lower share of resources that are counted at ELCC. If all resources are counted at ELCC, it should be relatively stable in looking at the total need. And we do find that, as I'll talk about the results as we go forward. It's also fairly straightforward in terms of running the simulations and communicating the results of the analysis. Next slide. So just an illustration of that. First step, identifying the PCAP total reliability need. So we just measure, we put in perfect resources into the model. We run the simulations against the load variability, the load forecast error, and the need to carry ancillary services during reserves. And we'll calculate the loss of load at the various levels, identify the level of perfect capacity in step 2 that gets us to the 1 day in 10 standard. Divide that perfect capacity by the median gross peak. So that's when I say the median gross peak, that's the peak before behind the meter PV output. We'll talk about the reasons for doing this, but behind the meter PV being counted as a supply side resource, again, allows us to maintain that kind of durable planning reserve margin. And then in step 3, we need to calculate the equivalent resource contributions for every resource class. So again, we're trying to treat all resources fairly, consistently. So for batteries, pump storage, wind, solar, behind the meter solar, hydro, conventional units, calculating that ELCC allows us to ultimately kind of maintain that perfect capacity reserve margin. Next slide. So considering the ELCC affirm generator is a departure from previous methods, and this is honestly a fairly new approach in the industry. We've done a lot of work exploring this around the country. We recognize that the need for reserves is not measured by the E4D. E4D tells you effectively what's the average forced outages across the year. We know that we need to carry more reserves than the average forced outages, because those events, those days where I have twice as many outages as normal, will hurt reliability more than those days when I have very few outages will help. So we have this natural asymmetry in the effect of generator outages. So this asymmetry we need to account for in the need for reserves. So we actually just run a simulation where we have those resources in, and then we take those resources out, and we can look at the difference in the planning reserve margin if I use perfect generation versus if I do the calculation on an ICAP basis and then make the adjustment using UCAP. So you can see the illustration to the right, the 3 different methods. We calculate our ICAP reserve margin, say it's 20%. If we adjust for E4D at 5%, it would say, hey, we need to carry a 15% perfect capacity or UCAP PRM. Ultimately, we've identified that we can meet the 1 day in 10 standard with perfect capacity resources of 14%. So it's less than what the UCAP derived using this E4D would suggest. So we need to pick up this additional generator performance impact. And as we look at the ELCCs, you'll see how we've quantified this impact. We do think it's measurable, and it's important to put all resources on the same basis. This will take into account not just that variability of outages, but also other interactions with the rest of the portfolio. Okay, so we've gotten all the way through the process to identify the perfect capacity reserve margin. Started with the 2030 California portfolio, tuned to 1 day in 10 by retiring firm resources. With those resources removed, the system's at 0.1. We then perform portfolio ELCC for the non-firm resources to identify the total contribution to reliability. There's a perfect capacity for the non-firm portfolio, and that includes all wind, solar, batteries, pump storage, behind-the-meter solar, demand response, and hydro. Calculate that total portfolio ELCC. With that portfolio ELCC, then we can identify the ICAP reserve margin. Again, we're going to provide this number for illustrative comparison purposes only, but the plan will use the PCAP PRM, not an ICAP PRM. Okay, so now we'll talk through the results. I've kind of hopefully provided a good background on the study approach and method. So the results of the simulation, and we did this for each of 24, 26, 2030, and 2035, identify the perfect capacity PRM. Again, the goal here, by using perfect capacity, wanted to maintain a fairly stable planning reserve margin, and we did find that effect to be true. The illustration on the right here for 2024, we identified a 13.8 reserve margin needed to meet the 1 day in 10 standard. So as we move from 24 to 26 to 30 to 35, only difference being slightly different load variability. We have a different load forecast. But we did find that the PCAP PRM resulted in very stable, very similar planning reserve margins for each of those years. So the values range from 13.5 to 14.0%. So again, we're able to maintain a very stable planning reserve margin by using this perfect capacity method. The drivers for the PRM, as we mentioned previously, the load variability. So we've got a range of up to 10% variability in summer peak conditions. We have a symmetric distribution of load forecast error. Again, another asymmetry here. Those years where we have higher load than expected will impact reliability more, and the years with lower uncertainty will help reliability. So that asymmetric impact drives the need for carrying some additional reserves to account for that. And then we carry 6% operating reserves during load shedding events to avoid cascading blackouts. We've modeled that as 3% upward spinning reserves and 3% regulation upward direction as well. Next slide. So again, just summarizing the last slide, those three components, those directly impact the total reliability need. So it's roughly 14%, 13.5 to 14%. We're doing the PRM on the gross load peak. Again, there's a slide that will talk about the managed versus gross in a few minutes. But the resource mix, this is important here. The resource mix does not impact the PCAP PRM since we're calculating the ELCC for all resource classes. It doesn't matter if we're 100% renewable or 0% renewable, and PCAP PRM will be the same. Next slide. So the PCAP PRM is not sensitive to the resource mix. The ICAP PRM would be sensitive to the resource mix. It's like part of our illustration is missing there. Maybe you can advance. I don't know if the illustration will show up. There we go. So the perfect capacity PRM, 13.5% reserve margin, depending on the year we're studying, again, in that 13.5 to 14% range. If we're looking at an ICAP reserve margin, if I measure a larger proportion of the fleet as resources that are counted using ICAP versus counted using ELCC, then the ICAP reserve margin is going to change. So that goes from a 13.5 PRM using perfect capacity up to an 18% PRM if I've got 45% of my portfolio as firm resources that have that outage impact included in their accreditation there. So we're adjusting by 5%. So keep in mind that firm portfolio only represents roughly half of the installed capacity, and it's got a 5% E4D. So that 5% E4D though increases the need in the total PRM by roughly 4%. So and we'll go through these numbers again down the road, but significantly larger impact on the PRM. So we've got to carry 4% additional reserves for a portfolio that's only represents half of the entire set of resources in the fleet. Now, if it was a larger percentage of the entire portfolio, so going to the 70% installed capacity scenario, and this is kind of referring back to prior studies several years ago, that may have been the ratio: 70% resources at firm, 30% using portfolio ELCC. So the comparison would have been against a 21.5% PRM. So again, this would have been counterintuitive as we're identifying more reliability risks as we've had recent hot weather, trying to take those effects into account. As we increase the share of resources that are measured under ELCC, the reserve margin would have declined using an ICAP PRM. We think that's a confusing, convoluted message. Ultimately, the PCAP PRM kind of cleans that up. Again, it's not sensitive to the portfolio mix, so it allows us for a more stable plan. Next slide. So trying to address the question of defining the PRM above the gross peak versus the managed peak. Again, that objective of maintaining a stable planning reserve margin by counting all resources at their ELCC credit allows us to maintain a stable reserve margin. If we did calculate perfect capacity reserve margin against the managed peak, since our managed peak is going to change over time as the behind the meter PV portfolio grows, the PCAP PRM would not be as stable. So with that intent of just looking at the planning reserve margin to measure the need to carry reserves for load variability, load forecast year, and the need for ancillary services during load shed, then moving the behind the meter and measuring the PCAP PRM against the gross load peak is more appropriate. I think we have an illustration of this on the next slide. So switching from a managed peak load basis to the gross load peak basis, you can see that as you increase the peak using behind the meter resources, so we're changing that load need, that's going to have an effect on the planning reserve margin. So it would not be stable if we were using behind the meter PV, if we were using managed peak to measure the planning reserve margin. So PCAP PRM against the gross peak before those behind the meter resources allows us to maintain that kind of fairly stable planning reserve margin. And I think here I'm going to pass it back off to Patrick Young.
Hi, everyone. I'm back. Thanks a lot, Kevin, for presenting the PRM study approach in great detail, as well as the results. Here, I want to wrap up this section by comparing to a recent RA study and then itemizing some conclusions from the work we've done over the past couple of months. So we've got this PCAP PRM result, and we'd like to be able to compare it to the ICAP PRM that has been published in recent months, particularly in the RA proceeding. So that is, I'm referencing the RA study report that was published around February 2022. And that study used earlier assumptions, or the previous IRP cycles assumptions for Survem and the data set associated with that. And that study calculated a monthly ICAP and UCAP PRM above the CAISO managed peak. So how do we compare that to the IRP's PCAP PRM result that we've just shown you? Well, the RA study, if stakeholders can remember, showed July through September 2024 ICAP PRM of 19 through 21% over the CAISO managed peak. Now, this IRP study that just calculated a PCAP PRM above the CAISO gross peak showed that the PCAP PRM is about 13.5 to 14% for study years that we covered between 2024 and 2035. So the first step that we need to do to make a comparison to the RA study is to note that, as Kevin covered earlier, that it's important to account for how much of resources are accounted using ELCC metrics versus the more familiar ICAP metric for counting the capacity against the total system need. So I think it'll be easiest if I just walk through this chart on the right here. So the axis, the y-axis is the ISO target planning reserve margin. And we've got different bar charts showing the different results using the different methodologies. So we start with the PCAP PRM over gross peak, where all resources are counted at 100%, or actually 100% of resources are counted using ELCC methods. Now, if we try to do an ICAP PRM, then the firm resources will be counted using ICAP, and the non-firm resources are counted using ELCC. And the relative proportion of that in the IRP study is 55% for the year 2030. Now, this is not comparable to the percent of resources that was counted at ICAP versus ELCC in the RA study. So we need to lower the percentage of resources that are counted at ELCC versus ICAP to make it comparable to the RA study. So we go from, so we did the ICAP PRM, and that produces an ICAP PRM at 18%. And now we've actually got to change the ratio of resources that are counted at firm versus. This is a very complicated thing to speak to, so I'm stumbling over my words a little bit, but we are basically changing the ratio of resources that are counted at ICAP versus counted at ELCC to make that mix look more like the RA study, because as Kevin stated earlier, this ratio of resources that are counted at ICAP versus ELCC does change the PRM percent, the ICAP PRM percent. So by changing that ratio, to make it more like the ratio that is present in the February 2022 RA study, we go to 21.5%. And in this middle column here, now the ICAP PRM has 30% of resources that are counted at ELCC and 70% that are counted with ICAP. And that is similar to the ratio of resources in the RA study that we are attempting to compare to. Now, the final step is that in the RA study, the PRM was calculated relative to managed peak, but in our PRM study for IRP, we are calculating the PRM versus over gross peak. So that final adjustment in transforming this PRM calculation so that we are calculating the PRM versus managed peak, the ICAP PRM now moves to 23.5%. So this final figure, 23.5% in the fourth column, is what we'd like to compare to the RA study from February 2022. So 23.5% is a little different from the 19 through 21% that was recorded in the RA study. And we believe this increase in reliability need can be attributed to modeling changes we've made since February 2022. Among them, we think the main driver is the addition of more extreme weather that was present in 2020, because the weather years we're using in Survem now encompass 2020, which previously they stopped at 2017. More details about how we actually did this comparison for our our PCAP PRM that we calculated for IRP, on how we did these calculations in order to be able to make a comparison to the RA ICAP PRM results from a few months ago. Those details are found in the appendix of this slide deck. So the final slide, next slide, I'm just going to wrap up with conclusions from the PRM study that we did for IRP. So we have a 14% PCAP PRM over gross peak, and we found that that is sufficient to meet the 0.1 loss of load expectation target across multiple years in our planning horizon, 2024 through 2035. And I've talked through how to compare that to recent ICAP PRM results. So that corresponds to an 18 to 21.5% ICAP PRM above gross peak. And if we further change that to an ICAP PRM above managed peak, then that PRM percent is 19.5% to 23.5%. And that range is, again, dependent on whether we do that transformation to change the ratio of resources that are counted at ICAP versus ELCC in the fleet that we are studying. So in IRP, all resources will be accredited at their PCAP equivalent, i.e. their ELCC, and the ELCC values that LSE should use in developing their IRPs will be released by the end of July 2022. As I mentioned on the previous slide, the IRP's PRM study did encompass weather year from 2020. So this apparently increases the total reliability of about 1 to 1.5 gigawatts relative to the RA proceeding results that stakeholders may remember from February 2022. Finally, the resolve portfolios from the updated preferred system plan model that was adopted earlier this year. If stakeholders can recall, we concluded that those resolve portfolios were more reliable relative to 0.1 LOLE, and we've shown that in our results because we had to remove some amount of resources in order to get to a 0.1 LOLE in our studies. And we expect to resolve this gap, no pun intended, in the work going forward, because we are revising the resolve model PRM constraint to use ELCC surface that is directly developed with the Survem model. So going forward, we expect that when resolve is run with these new inputs developed directly from Survem, the two models will be more consistent with each other in terms of a portfolio that is just reliable enough to meet a 0.1 loss of load expectation. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Nathan to facilitate Q&A on everything we've covered so far.
Thanks very much for that, Patrick and Kevin. So as Patrick mentioned, we're going to start our first Q&A session right now. As a reminder, please raise your hand to get in the queue. So you can use either the WebEx hand function or *3 if you're on the phone. When you speak up, it'd be very helpful if you could identify yourself, so both name and organization. And note that written Q&As are in some cases going to be getting addressed in the Q&A bar itself over on the right-hand side. So you might see some activity over there if you're interested. The first thing that I'm going to do while folks are queuing up for this Q&A, though, is address one of Brian Thieker's questions from a few minutes ago regarding the relationship between IRP and RA programs as they relate to reliability. So to read off Brian's question, it's interesting, perhaps ironic, that the CPUC IRP team is proposing to move towards ELCC for resource counting for all resources at the same time that RA program is moving away from using ELCCs for capacity counting. This would seem to drive IRP and RA programs farther apart rather than closer together. Could ED and Estrape please comment on this? Brian, I think it's a good point. At least it raises some interesting concepts that are probably on the tips of a lot of people's tongues. And it raises a point of coordination that we are already taking very seriously since RA kind of made public its direction on where things are headed with slice of day. And we intend to coordinate with them quite intensely as they're rolling out slice of day and the related items that you see in that decision about resource counting. I'd say on the face of it that an ELCC-based approach and a slice of day approach aren't inherently contradictory, but nor, to your point, are they inherently complementary. We think it requires a little bit more study, to be honest. And IRP and RA, though related, have different tasks. And at the risk of oversimplifying, I'll say that one might see IRP's procurement task as getting the physical resources that the system needs, and RA having their task as getting contracted resources on a shorter time frame. And even when RA used DLCCs for resource counting, they still had, and rightly so, different methods for doing so. They used generally average and monthly values, whereas in longer term planning like IRP, we use marginal and annual. But regardless, we do aim to coordinate with them on this, and thanks for raising it.
Nathan, just timekeeping. I know we started the Q&A here about just over 10 minutes behind our schedule, so we'll just have to see if we can catch it up.
That's helpful. So I think if we could seek to address all the questions in the Q&A bar within the Q&A bar for now, and take any verbal questions we have now before moving on. David, do we have any hands up?
Yeah, Gregory Klatt.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Gregory Klatt, for the Western Power Trading Forum. One big question is, how does this relate to the need to potentially update the PRM for RA? How does this study relate to the updating of the PRM for RA for 2024? And the reason I ask that question is, looking at all this, it appears that the results of this study support increasing the PRM for 2024 for RA somewhere between 19.5 and 23.5%.
Gregory, it's a good question. I'd say this not being an RA hosted webinar, it'd be tough for us to say how this is going to relate to RA, but duly noted.
Okay, then maybe another quick one. How does this relate to the recent ELCC study results that the utilities have submitted in the RPS proceeding?
Yeah, I can just comment briefly, and we haven't got to the LCC section yet, but perhaps follow up then, Gregory. But both the marginal LCC estimates, but there are different inputs used in the modeling, so it's going to take a bit of teasing out those, and we can perhaps pick that up more in the LCC section following.
Understood. Thank you.
A couple more. Andrew Mills. You're unmuted.
Hi, this is Andrew Mills from the California Community Choice Association. I just wanted to get a clarification on understanding the horizon for that 2.5% load forecast error. Just trying to understand, is this sort of like a day ahead forecast error, or is this like an annual year ahead type of forecast error? And if it is that sort of year ahead time horizon, is it really just based on sort of your like understanding of economic growth, or is it also incorporate some of the weather uncertainty that might happen?
I can take that one, Nathan.
Go ahead, Kevin.
Yep. This is an economic forecast error component only. So it's looking at the risk of under forecasting load growth. So we look at economic growth and the ratio of electric load growth to economic growth. So using historical data points and the distribution that Donald and his team use in here, I believe, is roughly based on analysis that we've done in applications around the country, and we can provide a link to that. I think, namely, the closest one is likely some analysis we did in ERCOT a few years ago. Just identifies that the risk to over forecasting, under forecasting falls in that range. So the highest, the 2.5% risk, says the economy may grow over a 2 to 4 year period by 6 or 7% faster than expected. If that does, then we'd expect load to grow by 2.5% more than we forecast. It does not take into account the weather uncertainties. The weather uncertainty is fully embedded in the weather profiles that we model.
Thanks, Kevin. Let me do 2 more if I can. Nick Pappas, you're unmuted. Nick. Nick Pappas, you're not online. Yeah, try now.
Can you hear me?
A little loud.
Faint, Nick.
Can you hear me now?
It's still very faint. Maybe we can circle back later.
I'll call back in.
All right, one more. Stephen Keene.
Yeah, I just have a question about the PCAP PRM drivers. When you're talking about reserves, you said you modeled 3% spinning reserve and 3% regulation up, but I believe what the CAISO uses is 3% spinning, 3% non-spinning, and then regulation, not exactly that. Did you look at how that would affect things, make a difference?
Patrick, do you want to take that? I know we've been discussing operating reserve assumptions with the CAISO.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that question about operating reserves?
Yeah, on your PCAP PRM drivers slide, you indicated that you modeled it as 3% spinning reserve and 3% regulation up. But I don't believe that's what the CAISO carries. I believe they carry 3% spinning reserves, 3% non-spinning reserves, and then certain amount of regulation. That I don't know exactly where that would be, but I don't think it's 3%. Can you just explain where you came up with those? And
Well, yeah, so our understanding is that the CAISO is required to hold 6% reserves before triggering load shed. And in Survem model in particular, because of the way the model is, we had to characterize that 6% as 3% spinning up and 3% regulation up.
Yeah, I'll just offer that so that there's a difference between what you maintain during normal operating conditions and what we maintain during firm load shed. And so 6% is kind of that threshold that Patrick mentioned. At that point, we're going to shed additional load in order to maintain that full 6% reserves. And those are expected to be online reserves, so either reg or spin. I think you're right. Characterization, 3% spin, 3% non-spin during normal conditions. If you look at the actual load shed in 2020, I think we were actually shedding roughly 5.5. We were maintaining 5.5%. So shedding to maintain 5.5%. But that tried to recognize 500 megawatts of load resources that could be called upon as well. So I think 6% is conservative but consistent with CAISO operations.
all right, thank you.
Brian Thaker may have had one follow-up here. Brian?
Thanks, David. Thanks, team. My question is on slide 24 and 28, it makes clear that the BTM PV is going to be counted using ELCC as a supply side resource. Is that true for all the behind the meter resources, for example, DR and behind the meter storage? Will they also be accredited via ELCC?
We're coming to the LCCs in the next section, so Aaron, perhaps we can pick that one up then.
Okay, thank you.
I think that's all for now.
Let's move on, David.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Aaron Burdick with E3. I'll be presenting the next section on ELCCs. Okay, so we will start with some of the material that was presented in May. So I'll try to kind of breeze through this so that we can have more time to talk about the latest modeling results, but some of this is sort of foundational to get the approach that we're taking. So starting off high level about how we think about resource accreditation within reliability planning. So no resource provides perfect capacity. And we can put resources on what we call a resource firmness spectrum here. So, in different jurisdictions, clearly, some of these might be higher or lower in their effective capacity value, but we can broadly categorize different resources into 3 categories. So there are variable energy resources that are dependent upon the weather to generate electricity. There are use-limited resources that can be dispatched but are subject to physical, environmental, or contractual constraints that limit when you can dispatch them and for how long you can dispatch them. And then there are firm capacity resources that are available to be dispatched on demand. They may be subject to forced outages or fuel security, but generally are available to operate when called upon. And then we have on the far right a perfect capacity resource that has 100% effective capacity value. This is sort of the resource unicorn. It doesn't actually exist, but it provides a useful comparison metric for us when we want to put all of the resources on the left on a level playing field, which we do when we are calculating an ELCC value. Next slide, please. So we talked earlier today about the need for alignment of the 2 key aspects of reliability planning, the need determination and the resource accreditation. So traditionally, we have been planning for firm capacity resources. So in this example, we have a stack of nuclear, coal, and gas resources, and the accredited capacity in an ICAP planning world is simply the sum of their installed capacities. When we move into a clean energy future where we have a lot of non-firm resource additions, so solar, wind, storage, demand response, we need a more accurate metric that can measure their capacity value. And that is why we use effective load carrying capability. And if we want all resources to be on a level playing field, as also was described earlier, then we want to accredit all of them using ELCC. And when we do so, the reserve margin percentage and the reserve margin megawatt decreases relative to the installed capacity requirement, even to reach the same reliability target. So in other words, we're calculating a perfect capacity megawatt that gets us to 0.1 LOLE, and then we're accrediting all resources based on their perfect capacity equivalent. So that's the PCAP approach that we're taking here. And when we do so, the reliability contribution of that portfolio of resources, which can be some firm, some non-firm, some use limited, some variable, that becomes a complex function of those resource interactions. Next slide, please. So again, this is one we covered a few months ago. I think folks are generally familiar with this, but ELCC is able to capture dynamics that result from interactions between different resources. So if we take a ISO summer looking load shape here and we add only a variable energy resource like solar, we can see the peak is reduced. So we're shifting the peak from the mid-afternoon into the early evening. And in doing so, we're reducing the marginal capacity value of increasing increments of solar. And if we take that same system and we only added storage, we would start to clip the peak and we'd start to flatten the hours of risk so that the more storage we add, the more the marginal value of additional increments will decline. But if we add solar and storage together, there's what we call a diversity benefit where the whole can exceed the sum of its parts. And so solar pushes the peak into the evening and it narrows the peak, which benefits storage, and then storage pushes the peak back into the solar hours, and it also can use solar energy for charging. So all of these dynamics are captured in the ELCC approach using the weather conditions that drive reliability risk. And it's important to note that even though in an ELCC approach, we are using a capacity-based accreditation metric, so we take a solar megawatt and we multiply it by a percentage ELCC, that the percentage value inherently captures both capacity output and energy availability across a range of weather conditions. So as we'll see when we start talking about results, the storage ELCC, for instance, may start to decline if it doesn't have sufficient energy to charge it. And in such a scenario, we'd start to see the solar marginal ELCC increase because it provides energy in the middle of the day for charging. So this is just to note, ELCC captures both capacity and energy adequacy. So coming back to our function of resources that gets us our total reliability value or total portfolio ELCC of a resource portfolio, we can draw that on a simplified curve on the right here. And the height of that curve at any point is the portfolio ELCC, so the perfect capacity equivalent megawatts. And that will increase as we add more of a resource. If you're abstractly minded, you can expand this one-dimensional curve into multiple dimensions, which is what we do when we're considering a portfolio of multiple types of resources. So solar, wind, storage, firm capacity, etc. So that becomes this multi-dimensional surface whereby the height of the surface at any point is the total portfolio ELCC, or the total reliability value of that portfolio. And the functional form of the surface is unknowable. Resource interactions are complex. They change as you add more resources and shift the hours of reliability risk. But we can map out different points within this surface, which is what we do when we calculate a marginal ELCC. So we take a given point, meaning a given portfolio of solar, wind, batteries, etc. And we say, at that point on the surface, what is the value of adding an additional increment of solar or wind or storage? So that gives us the marginal ELCC at a specific point on the surface. In other words, for a specific portfolio. Average ELCCs require you to take the height of the surface, the portfolio ELCC, and then to allocate that amongst individual resource classes. And so that requires sort of inherent trade-offs around how you allocate the contributions of each resource type and the interactive effects. Next slide. So when we think about what ELCCs make sense to use for LSE planning, we can understand that average ELCCs, if you add up all of the average ELCCs for a portfolio, they will equal the total reliability need of that portfolio, assuming that you're at the reliability standard. However, if we are considering long-term planning and incremental capacity investments for new resources, the average ELCCs are going to overinflate the reliability value of additional investments. So that's why marginal ELCCs provide a more precise signal to LSEs about the incremental reliability value of resource additions that would be added as part of their plans. And as Nathan mentioned, this is why in IRP, we've typically used marginal ELCCs, such as for the MTR procurement order, also used in the RPS program, least cost best fit approach, which is valuing incremental resource additions. And then at the bottom of this slide, we have a table with the average and marginal ELCCs that are close to the 2030 values that we found in our study. So you can see the major difference is in the solar ELCC. So on a marginal basis, solar only has a 6% ELCC. On an average basis, it has 36%. So if we were to provide average ELCCs for solar to LSEs as part of their planning, they would believe that they can add significant amounts of solar with a 36% ELCC to meet their share of the system reliability need. But when we try to aggregate all of those plans together, we'll find that the system hasn't actually gotten that much incremental reliability value because it's actually only getting 6% for each megawatt of solar that's being added. So next slide, I think Neil's going to take this one.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. Neil Raffin on the IRP team. Yeah, so as Aaron said, he's done a bit of recapping of what we prepared in the April MAG on approach to LCCs, and we'll get to the results shortly so far, which is fresh information. And the other key highlight on the LC section is to say that since April, staff are requiring LSEs to use marginal LCCs for developing their individual plans due this year. So a bit more about that. In addition to considering average or marginal ELCCs, we also considered using some combination. And so to consider these different options, we've looked at the economic efficiency that Aaron was explaining there. And then there are other trade-offs involving like fairness and then also the feasibility of implementation. And so stepping through these options, we see marginal LCCs, as Aaron said, in addition to having that efficient signal for investment, they're also feasible to implement in this process. Whereas average LCCs also feasible to implement and could be used to credit specific LSEs for their past procurement. And then a combination may be able to achieve efficiency and fairness, however, is more complex and we need more further thought on how to implement that. So on balance, staff's thought is that marginal is the approach to use because of that efficiency benefit. It's more likely to help LSEs towards selecting the optimal mix of resources in their plans. And so to implement this, we provided LSEs directly on July 1 information about their load share and share of behind the meter PV. And then the remaining information they need to implement this is contained in the resource data template, the RDT, the one we posted a few days ago, as well as the upcoming one, which will complete the picture later this month. But I'll hand back to Aaron with more on how we're going to implement this.
Okay, so when we think about implementing a marginal ELCC paradigm, there's a few different ways to think about need determination and resource accreditation. So if you look at the diagram on the right of this slide, the left side is the total reliability need. So this is similar to the approach that we took to calculate the planning reserve margin. So the height of that green bar, the TRN, at 0.1 LOLE will get you the total megawatts that gets you to 14% planning reserve margin. And if we have a portfolio of resources that meets that reliability standard, then the portfolio ELCC of those resources would equal the same height of that total reliability need. And this total reliability need is not dependent, again, on the resource portfolio. But when we look at marginal ELCCs, so when we, instead of calculating the total portfolio ELCC of that portfolio, we take the same portfolio resources and calculate the marginal ELCCs for each resources. We can take the sum of those marginal ELCCs, which gets us a lower megawatts. And this lower megawatt amount is the marginal reliability need. So effectively, you could conceptualize this like the fact that we have shifted the peak from the gross peak to the net peak. And so at the net peak, there's a lower megawatts of resources that are needed. And then the marginal ELCC is effectively accrediting the potential of each resource type to reduce reliability risk during the net peak hours. And the net peak hours, in other words, the hours of reliability risk, are going to shift as that portfolio evolves over time. So the marginal reliability need is a function of the resource portfolio. And specifically, if you're adding resources that have declining marginal ELCCs, then that marginal reliability need is going to decrease over time. So this diagram is intended to represent basically that you can have the same portfolio that meets the same reliability standard. And when you use a marginal approach, you're basically reducing the total megawatts that you're saying is needed, but then you're reducing the total megawatts that get accredited because you're using marginal ELCCs. So even though the megawatt target looks lower, you're counting resources lower, so you can reach the same level of reliability. And so the need determination will be this marginal reliability need that is calculated based on the Survem ELCC outputs. Need allocation to LSEs could use the LSE load share during the net peak hours. However, for this round, since we didn't have hourly forecasts of each LSE's loads across the planning horizon, we're using the recently produced managed peak share forecasts that the CEC released. And we think this is a decent proxy for the net peak by 2024. So the managed peak itself is already pushed out past the solar hours. So we're talking about basically LSE share of the sort of 7 to 8 p.m. Load. And then resource accreditation, obviously we use marginal ELCCs. So how did we set up the marginal ELCC study? Step one is to take the updated preferred system plan portfolio and to calibrate that portfolio to 0.1 LOLE. So whenever we do an ELCC calculation, we're starting from a system at the reliability standard. And this was done by adding or removing firm capacity resources. Then we calculate marginal ELCCs for 11 different resource classes: 2 solar, 3 wind, 3 storage, demand response hydro, and firm resources. We do this for 5 years. And once we have that information, we can calculate the marginal reliability need, which again is the sum of the last in marginal ELCCs for that reliable portfolio. And then step 4, we do some post-processing to make sure we have all of the detailed inputs that LSEs need to do their planning. So we break hydro out between large and small hydro using NQC values from the RA program. We interpolate between different storage durations. For the firm resources, we only calculated an aggregate firm resource marginal ELCC to reduce the study size. And so we basically allocate that firm ELCC by scaling the forced outage rates of the different subclasses. So we have E4Ds for combined cycles and combustion turbines and geothermal. And then we are scaling those so that the sum of all of the firm resources equals the marginal ELCC that was calculated. For wind, we allocate to subclasses beyond the 3 that we modeled using the recent study that was released in the RA proceeding. And then for the years that we didn't model, we interpolate the ELCCs and the reliability need between the years that we did model. Okay, so moving to the study results. So as was noted in the email announcement and earlier here, we have a partial set of results. We are processing the last 2 modeled years as we speak, and those will be released along with the interpolations for all the other years later this month. We'll also be releasing the 30 MMT scenario, the LCC forecast. Here we're showing the 38, meaning 38 in 2030. And this basically provides a table of all of the resource classes that are provided, except the firm class is aggregated because we couldn't fit it all into one slide. So that's in the appendix. And I think we can go to the next slide to talk about the dynamics. This is just a little bit easier way than trying to look at all the percentages in a big table. So here we've shown the solar and wind marginal ELCCs on the left and the other resources on the right. So noting some broad trends here, solar and wind ELCCs, unsurprisingly, considering we've added many gigawatts of these resources, are generally low and decrease by 2030 as more renewables are added to the system. So one thing to note, even though with the behind the meter PV and certainly with the utility scale PV, we've pushed the net peak into the evening. If we didn't have other resources, as I mentioned earlier, there is this diversity benefit that we see by 2024 once significant amounts of batteries are added to the system. So solar actually maintains some continued value for being able to charge battery storage. And then we see that out-of-state wind and offshore wind provide higher ELCCs than in-state wind. They have much higher capacity factors, but they do also all decline a bit by 2030 as more of those resources are added. The 4-hour storage ELCCs in 2024 end up around 70%. This is driven by the very large build out of storage for midterm reliability that's in the preferred system plan. However, we find that the storage ELCCs are quite sensitive in this range to the amount of solar that's in the portfolio. So they increase a bit by 2026 as a large amount of solar gets added in the PSP. And then they continue to decline by 2030 as short duration storage saturates. Long duration storage provides higher marginal ELCC. Demand response generally follows the storage trends, being another use limited resource. The hydro and the firm ELCCs are generally more stable over time. So this slide just goes to the point that I mentioned a second ago, that in the mid-2020s, we're at this point in the solar and storage surface where the diversity benefits, so those interactive effects, become quite high. And so we have three graphs on the right here. The top graph shows the solar and storage penetration between 2022 and 2035. So IRP stakeholders are familiar with the very large amounts of solar and storage being added in the PSP. So you can see that in that chart. And then below that, we have some heat maps that we pulled from the solar and storage surface development that we're working on in Survem to update the Resolve tool. And what we can see there is that at a given level of solar, if we add more battery capacity, we can see that the marginal ELCC of solar starts to increase, again, because of those interactive effects. And then we can see on the bottom in purple, at a given battery penetration, the storage ELCCs for a constant amount of battery storage, those can increase if we add more solar capacity. So that just goes to explain some of the dynamics that we're seeing in the mid-2020s when the solar and storage ELCCs increase a bit between our study years.
Thanks, Aaron. And Nathan, as we open up for questions on this one, just noting we're about 15 behind. I might be able to make some time on this next section, but I think this Q&A, we should try and keep 10 minutes available, given it's on the LCC results, which are new content since April.
You know, it's a good point. And what we can do for some more time savings is after maybe one or two questions of verbally in this Q&A, we can ask all other questions to go into the Q&A bar on the right hand of the WebEx window for the foreseeable, so that we can answer there in parallel with the presentations. So David, do we have any hands up? And just a reminder to question askers to introduce yourself, name and organization.
Paul Nelson.
Hi, this is Paul Nelson on behalf of CLECA, or the California Large Energy Consumers Association. I'm trying to understand your results for demand response, because you show fairly high numbers in the near term, but then a pretty significant drop in 2030. So how did you model the base interruptible program, which is available, because the customers are high load factor, and the program's available 24/7, though it does have a 6-hour per call limitation, and it has overall annual limitations. But I'm kind of curious on how it was modeled is being available in your analysis.
Kevin, would you like to take that one, how we modeled demand response in Survem?
Yeah, happy to just talk about the technical modeling details. I'm not sure if the question also had an aspect to it asking about kind of the volumes or which particular programs we model in there. But the demand response, is treated as a resource in Survem. So we have the loads fully embedded in the load profiles, and then we model their response as a resource with contract limitations that each program has. So hours per day, contract days per year, or dispatches per year, all the various contract details. And Patrick may even need to speak to some of that, but I believe that Patrick and Donald and their team has worked to identify, qualify, quantify each of those inputs for modeling directly in Survem.
So the load reductions, or the load impacts, what was the source of that information?
We developed the demand response program constraints from the load impact reports that are annually put out in the demand response proceeding. So we've got the BIP and AC cycling and various other programs broken out by the IOUs, defined in Survem.
Okay.
BIP is a relatively small proportion of the total DR capacity going out into the future years in Survem. So we may not be seeing the effect of BIP being available 24/7 may be clouded by the rest of the DR programs that are being aggregated to have a DR as a whole resource in Survem that we calculate the ELCC for.
Yeah, so one of the things about using load impact protocols is that for the utility programs, it assumes a 4 to 9 p.m. call currently. But such as the base interruptible program, it's not restricted to a 4 to 9 p.m. call. It's actually available, outside those area hours. And then going forward, you need to consider that, the defined call or the assumed call that may be out of the load impact protocols and the requirements for DR are going to change over time. And so while today we're looking at DR to be available predominantly to count as a resource adequacy resource from 4 to 9 p.m., as you said, as you introduce more solar and storage, the distribution of the loss of load expect changes. Well, so will the DR availability and the design of the programs. So the 2030 value, if it doesn't sort of incorporate the fact that the availability of the DR program changes along with it, I'm not so sure how value will be looking out at 2030. I mean, except for as an indicator is, yeah, you need to change the program design.
Yeah, that's a fair point, and that's a challenge with modeling DR, as we expect the program parameters to change and respond to system needs that are in the near future. And as we go out to 2030, because we don't know what's going to happen in the future, it becomes difficult to try and reflect that.
Something we can put on our list of improvements. But thank you for that, Paul.
Thank you.
So what I'd propose, just in the name of time savings here, and apologies to those in the queue, if you have your hand up and you have a question, please could you put it in the Q&A bar over on the right-hand side, and we'll try to address over the next couple minutes. If not, we will have some time at the end to address any unaddressed questions. Also, just a reminder for those that have had their hand up but had their question answered, please just tick the button again to unraise your hand. I think we can move to the next section.
Thanks, Nathan. Okay, just quickly then to really pull from those study results presented by Patrick and Aaron, we're now able to have LSEs plan for reliability as part of their individual IRPs for the first time in the IRP process. The first two cycles did not have explicit reliability planning standards. So at a high level, LSEs, to do that, LSEs need two things. One being, what's their reliability requirement by year specific to them? And two, what resource accreditation should they use by year to show that they've met that? So on the next slide, this has got a screenshot of the RDT itself, and just to try and draw the linkage to the earlier results, this resource data template version was posted on the IRP website on Friday. And to orient you, those yellow shaded cells where LSEs will need to input information that they've been provided by staff on July 1, whereas the rest of the snapshot here of this template is those white cells are either hard-coded values or formula already in the template that LSEs don't need to change. And then just walking through this, so the CAISO gross peak there is the 1 and 2 managed peak plus behind the meter PV, both from the IPA hourly CAISO level forecast. The PCAP PRM, or PRM, there is the PCAP PRM that of 14% that Patrick presented earlier. That's then applied to the CAISO gross peak, and then then there's a ratio used, the marginal reliability need to total reliability need ratio to translate that for LSEs to determine their share of the marginal reliability need. And Aaron explained the calculation just before about how to get marginal reliability need, basically taking the nameplate capacity of each resource type, multiplying it by the LCC percentage, marginal LCC percentage, and summing those. So that's how that's found. That's all in the template already. And then the LSEs manage peak share. In this example here, 10%, and then that gets the LSEs marginal reliability need in perfect capacity equivalent. The bottom row of this slide here is just indicating the behind the meter PV forecast for each LSE. Again, that's been provided to LSEs by staff, and that starts the rest of the template, which is not shown here, which is basically how can the LSE count the behind the meter PV towards their marginal reliability need, as well as all the other resource types that they're including in their plans. And then on the next slide, just a few thoughts from staff on the implications of LSEs using their marginal LCCs. By counting all resources, whether they're new or existing at their marginal LCC, each LSE's marginal need will be a lower number than their share of the total reliability need. Doesn't mean it's easier to meet. It's not a lower reliability standard that we're setting by using marginal. It appears to be a low number but at the same time, the resource accreditation that must be used, the marginal LCCs, are also lower than generally the equivalent if we have looked at average ELCCs. So just repeating again, both methods properly measure total system level reliability need. And then just playing this out over the course of a few IRP cycles, these are the resource counting to be used for the LSE plans this year. We're playing this out over a few cycles. As Aaron explained, we would need to update both the marginal reliability need and the resource accreditation to keep pace with expected resource mix. So LSEs would see changing signals, planning signals, as the system portfolio changes over time. And of course, look, this topic of reliability filing requirements is just one among a number of basic constraints or objectives LSEs are planning for. There are, of course, also GHG reduction, there are renewable portfolio standard requirements, resource adequacy program requirements. There's procurement orders like the midterm reliability order. These have got to be factored into the LSE's planning, not necessarily explicitly, but that's what's going through the planning process for LSEs. And they've also got their own unique strategies to manage risk exposures and costs, the cost outcomes for their customers. So now we're going to turn to a couple of parties that Nathan mentioned who are doing modeling in this proceeding. And I'll introduce our presenters shortly from Southern California Edison and PG&E. They've got about 10 to 15 minutes each to present, and then we've got a bit of time for questions of them. To be clear, the purpose of these presentations and questions stakeholders may have about them don't affect the load serving entities filing requirements that we've just gone through right now. Those are set and need to be used for individual plans to be filed later this year. But we've got broader objectives in this webinar, as Nathan highlighted, and that's in aid of the later modeling we're going to keep doing in this cycle of IRP for other use cases. IRP mid to long-term procurement program, the PRM to be used in IRP modeling more broadly, etc. So we appreciate these parties taking the time to model and inform the thinking for those use cases. Okay, so we got PG&E slides up first. So with that, I'll hand over to Matt Kawatani. Thanks, Matt.
Let's see, Matt. Matt's on several times. Are you on now? Let's don't do that. Does that work, Matt?
Hello, are you able to hear me?
Yeah, but slight echo. Let's try it again. Hold on, Matt. You're on 3 different places. Let's try that one. Can you talk now?
Hello?
Yes.
Okay. So before we get started, PG&E just wanted to recognize Energy Division for developing a PRM based on LOE modeling and for developing a process which allows for stakeholder vetting and feedback. The IRP Reliability Framework is a critical component in developing a comprehensive system portfolio, which underlies system planning efforts. An overly reliable portfolio not grounded in other constraints would result in an over-procured, unaffordable system, while an unreliable system would result in costly emergency procurement orders, either scenario inhibiting the state's climate goals. So PG&E just want to acknowledge the stakes in getting the reliability framework right, and also just give recognition to Energy Division for valuing multiple analyses and presentations in this stakeholder process. So upfront, PG&E has its key messages based on its current draft PRM results. The first is that PG&E supports the two PRM methodology changes proposed by ED. So PG&E study methodology and the results displayed here incorporate a PRM calculation based on the gross peak and perfect capacity modeling. Second, PG&E's PRM results are largely aligned with ED's. PG&E study shows a 13% PRM is appropriate, slightly lower than ED's results presented during today's workshop. And then third, we just want to highlight, as other presenters have acknowledged, that an appropriate resource accreditation is critical to ensuring a comprehensive reliability framework. So we look forward to reviewing and benchmarking some of the results and the methodology that's presented here today. So in the following slides, we'll essentially walk through how PG&E has concluded that a 13% is reasonable, similar to ED's 14%. So in this slide, we're showing some of the key assumptions in our Survem model. In assessing an appropriate PRM for the IRP, we conducted LOE modeling, developing a PRM calibrated to the industry standard 0.1 LOE. The basis for PG&E's Survem model used for this LOE analysis was the CPUC's 2020 RSP Survem model with incremental changes. So in terms of assumptions critical to the PRM perfect capacity modeling, we'll just highlight that PG&E's model includes 24 weather years, 1998 through 2021, and load assumptions calibrated to the most recent 2021 IPER forecast or the IAWG high electrification forecast. So the other assumptions highlighted in this slide do not impact our study's resulting PRM, but will be important for resource accreditation modeling. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the scenarios and the scope that PG&E had laid out in terms of determining an appropriate PRM for the IRP and scenarios which are currently being studied for resource accreditation. So PG&E specifically looked to isolate load forecast changes and study year changes to ensure a durable reliability framework and confidence that a single PRM could be appropriate for the 2022-2023 IRP planning horizon. So you can see, for example, in 2030 that we have studied the IPER 2021 mid case, the IAWG high electrification, as well as IPER 2021 plus high EV. Next slide, please. So here we're showing the numbers which underlie PG&E's PRM calculation and a benchmark against our estimation of ED's draft PRM results. In the first row, you'll see the perfect capacity needed to achieve a 0.1 LOLE. And in the second row, you see the gross peak the perfect capacity is measured against, and the resulting PRM based on those two metrics. Assuming the CAISO gross peaks are aligned and knowing ED's 14% PRM, we calculated the perfect capacity difference resulting from the 1% PRM difference, which would inform resource planning. The 600 megawatts of perfect capacity difference for a 2030 IPER mid scenario is not unreasonable. And again, we'll just highlight that, we look forward to reviewing the resource accreditation metrics presented today and the reasonableness of the overall framework that takes into account the PRM and the resource counting. So next slide, please. So in terms of non-PRM reliability analysis that PG&E conducted, here we're showing our LOLE results for the PSP portfolios in 2 different study years and 2 different load forecasts. You can see, especially in 2035, the IAWG high electrification forecast is more aggressive from both a peak and load perspective and would result in a difference in terms of system reliability. PG&E highlights this difference to encourage use of the IAWG forecast in the IRP, but notes in both scenarios, the PSP includes sufficient capacity to achieve a 0.1 LOLE. The thermal capacity adjustment here is only meant to show a rough approximation for perfect capacity that could be removed. So those are the slides and results that PG&E has for this presentation. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Matt. We'll go straight to Amy Lee from SCE. And then after Amy's presented, we could take questions on both the IOU's presentations.
Can you hear me?
Yes, thanks, Amy.
Great. Good morning, everyone. This is Amy Lee from Southern California, Edison. I'm the Senior Manager of the Modeling and Analysis Price Forecasting Group. So one of the main responsibility for our group is, performing the modeling and analysis to support LSE's participation in the IRP. And I also want to, thank CPUC for the opportunity to share our modeling approach for the coming IRP, and also we're looking forward for the work with the CPUC and the different parties in a continuous improve, for the modeling analysis space. So, for this presentation today, I mainly want to, give a high level overview about Edison's modeling approach for the CAISO system-wide analysis. In the past few years, we gradually established our modeling, approach, iterative process, to starting from the capacity expansion model to build the most economic resource plans, then pass to the detailed production cost simulation to validate feasibility of the operability of the portfolio, including checking the GHG emission, clean energy requirement for the portfolio built in the capacity expansion. And most importantly, we also, gradually build our capability to perform, stochastic 500 runs, to, evaluate the reliability performance of the portfolio. So those 3 steps are the critical component in LSE's iterative CAISO-wide system analysis. And also, as I mentioned, it's iterative. If there's any, violation in the feasibility or the reliability issue we find in step 2 or step 3, we go back to the step 1 capacity expansion to make adjustments. So this time, when we perform the IRP analysis, we do observe there are some issues specifically tied to the capacity expansion. The planning reserve margin is the main metric we used to ensure the resource adequacy and reliable resource portfolio. However, this PRM framework may work well in the system where it has a dominant resource of dispatchable resource like a gas. However, as we know, California has a significant increase of the intermittent renewable resources such as wind, solar, and also energy limited resource. So, this energy limited resource, while they are playing a critical role, to support California reach decarbonization, they also add significant complexity to our modeling and analysis. So when we look at the single hour capacity requirements as the PRM, the existing framework may not work well because the duration of the critical reliability hours may longer due to the intermittent resource portfolio in the system. They may not has consistent the expected energy showing in the single hour defined in the PRM, and also with the a lot of significant energy limited resource such as the DER in the system, it's also important to ensure there's a sufficient energy charged to provide energy to let them discharge support the system reliability during the critical hours. So that's probably one of the the issue we observe in the current capacity expansion process. However, as previously mentioned, there's already a change already made in the resource adequacy space. Recently, Commission adopted the 24 slice of the day framework in RA. So Edison decided, we are going to make the change in the 2020 IRP process, and we are going to adopt a similar framework, 24 hourly slice framework, implemented in our first step of capacity expansion modeling. Please move to the next slide. Thank you. So, as I mentioned here, we have a similar, observation in the RA, in the previous RA framework. The RA showing mainly focus on, one of the critical hour for the month. With this newly adopted 24-hour slice of the day, this RA requirement will be extended from 1 hour to the worst day of the month. And in this, the worst day of the month, each LSE must demonstrate there will be enough capacity, on hourly basis to satisfy both the energy and also planning reserve margin requirements. So if you look at the left-hand side chart, there's a illustrative chart for the entire system. On the 24-hour basis, you can see there's an expected energy from different type of the resource. The blue bars shows the solar shape, how solar production for the different hour to support system energy needs. And also the battery, you can see the yellow bar on the top that indicates the battery charging to support the system reliability. So one of the most important component in this RA framework is we are going to adopt the new resource counting rule to make sure we count the resource, their contribution to these critical days of the month in an appropriate manner. So for the solar and the wind as example, we are going to look at hourly profile, use expected energy on hourly basis to count their contribution. And also, similar, principle for the standalone battery and use limited resource. And also, the last one I would like to emphasize here, one of the key, perspective for this 24-hour slice of day framework is we need to ensure there's a sufficient excess capacity, for the storage, such as the pump storage, energy storage, to make sure there'll be enough charging or pumping energy, to allow them to dispatch or pump, generate during the critical hours to support system reliability. Move to the next slide. Great. So in this RA framework, we believe this is a very good approach to better capture the resource need to support the system reliability. So Edison decided to make a first step improvement in the IRP modeling to fill the gaps between the RA and the IRP proceedings. So what are we going to do is we are going to make changes in the step 1 of capacity expansion modeling, and mainly focus on the CAISO-wide system analysis. So very similar to what I mentioned here in the RA framework, we are going to look at one critical days through the whole year. To some modeling simplification, we may not at this time we may not look at the worst day of the month, exactly the same as the RA, but at least we are going to look at the worst day of the year, or the 24 hours, to see how the CAISO system to build new resources and also dispatch existing resource to satisfy the energy and PRM requirement on 24-hour basis. And also, as part of this modeling approach, we are also going to make sure we count resource properly, to use their expected energy contribution on 24 hours basis, based on their 24-hour profile applied in the model configuration. And also the last one is we are going to also ensure the energy, not only for the discharge or generation during the hours, but also ensure there will be sufficient charging or pumping load for the storage and the pumping storage devices. So at the end, what we want to do here is we have a two approach side by side. The left-hand side is the newly improved capacity expansion modeling. The right-hand side will be the existing PRM single-hour requirement. Edison plan to perform capacity expansion and the later reliability assessments using these two different modeling approach. We are going to compare the resource build-out differences, the cost, and also their performance using the same reliability metrics. Hopefully, through this process, we can provide useful insight and also healthy, the feedback about, help us further improve in the future modeling methodology. With that, I conclude my presentation.
Thanks very much, Amy. I, for one, am very curious about Edison's results on particularly the capturing of slice of day and capacity expansion modeling as the set of reliability constraints that you'll be working around.
Sure. Yeah, we are quite excited, looking forward to have, result and share with everybody here.
Nathan, the timekeeper here, just updating, we're back on track with timings. So thanks, Matt and Amy. We've got time for questions now for both of those presenters.
David, any hands?
Yeah, I see Tom Beach has a new hand. Tom, you're unmuted.
I'm sorry, I had my hand up. I typed my question in. Sorry about that. I forgot to take it down.
Thanks. Paul Nelson, same with you. Is your hand still up?
Sorry, I guess I need to figure out how to lower the hand.
That's okay. That's okay. Nick Pappas, let's see if you can be heard now. Let me try the second one. Nick, are you there now?
Hey, David, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, thanks. Sorry about the issue before. I'm getting an echo, but hopefully I can articulate and folks can hear me okay. Nick Pappas, I'm a consultant to NRDC. Want to echo the comments throughout the day on how appreciative I am of all the new modeling work that's been done, both my energy division and Edison and PG&E. My question is kind of for all three. You know, we have a somewhat nonlinear path between the planning track and precisely what resources get procured. And as has been discussed today and elsewhere, LOLE analysis and the Elcc can be pretty sensitive to the portfolio assumptions, particularly the mix, both magnitude and ratio of preferred resources. And I'm wondering if folks have thoughts on how sensitive these results are and what we can do to mitigate that, either on the planning side or perhaps for the future workshop on the kind of LSE compliance side.
Nick, forgive me if I try to summarize. Is the question, hey, can you guys call out some particular assumptions that we think are sensitive, or just to acknowledge the general concept that you're elevating?
Yeah, Nathan, thanks. I think the question is, as we take these results moving forward, do we need to be aware of, you know, yes, the specific impacts of divergence between the indicative portfolio that's studied here and what comes together, and also as we're building this process, are there guardrails we can put in place that either, you know, realign the ELCC and LOLE studies or kind of drive LSEs closer to that indicative portfolio if that's the direction we're going in. So it's kind of both a substance and process question.
I've got a couple of thoughts, but invite Nathan and Aaron. But I suppose, you know, the team here has made clear that a PCAP PRN is durable as resource mix changes. But we've also, emphasized that the marginal reliability need is sensitive to the resource mix of the future, and so are marginal ELCCs. And I suppose the main guardrail we've got here is an iterated planning process where LSEs each cycle get an updated set of standards to use. And meanwhile, procurement's happening on the ground, and you know, expectations about the future can change, and we can factor those into our assumptions for the future as a planning community. So it's not a riskless process, but probably nor should it be, just given the nature of planning and the transition we're trying to make. As for quantifying like the impact of resource mix on the standards, I think it's probably not possible to do that, you know, right now. But I guess, Aaron, do you have any short thoughts to share on that?
Yeah, I'll just add, you know, here we're really in IRP, especially that IRP plans are really focused on long-term planning. So while I think, you know, there is certainly some uncertainty around, you know, how quickly we move into the more wind, more solar, more battery future that all of our IRP cases show, I think we see across a range of system level optimizations that's broadly the future that we're heading towards. So I think the ELCCs that are provided here indicate the value of different resources, how those change as we're moving into that future. So I think probably, you know, there is always some uncertainty around what portfolio will happen in what future year. And that's just the nature of this process, that we have to have a forecast. And this is the one that we're using this round. But I think the long-term trends that are captured in these ELCCs are generally consistent across all the cases that we're modeling in the planning track.
Okay, thanks to you both, and we'll look forward to seeing how this unfolds in the procurement program efforts as well.
Thanks, Nick.
And actually, just to I'll get to it on next steps. Thanks, Nick.
Nathan, I don't see any new hands right now.
Thanks, David. I think that means we can move to the next section.
Yeah, so that's Ali Ashraghi to present on INA.
Thank you, Neil.
And David, the slides are still in, well, they're not in presenter mode. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Good afternoon, all. I'm Ali Ashraghi, analyst, IRP team. In this section, we just wanted to give a brief update about the inputs and assumptions, aka INA development process and timing for this IRP cycle. The INA document is a reference document that we use for IRP modeling within a given cycle. This document describes key data elements, assumptions, and methodologies, including load forecast, baseline resources, candidate resources, resource costs and potentials, operating assumptions, and policy constraints, etc. We plan for this cycle, we plan to have this document, the 2022 INA, ready to be used for developing the 2023 PSV, the PSV for this cycle, and associated TP portfolios, which is 2024-25 TP portfolio. I just note that, as you know, there are more near-term use cases that we needed and we need to make limited INA updates for them before we finish the whole INA process and finalize the document for developing the PSV. The first one was the filing requirements assumptions. Staff made limited INA updates for the modeling needed to develop filing requirements. The updated result package has been posted on June, in second half of June. The other near-term use case that we need to make limited INA updates is for developing the TPP for this cycle, 2023-2024 TP portfolio. As part of the TP process, we provide an overview of these updates as we develop the TP portfolio for this cycle. Next slide, please. But going back to the process for developing the INA for this cycle, for developing the PSP, staff expect to finalize the INA document in the fourth quarter of this year, including the stakeholder process. This would be in time to be used for developing the 2023 PSP, and also a reference for those parties that want to do their own modeling at the same time that we develop the PSP. As part of this process, the staff will hold MAG webinars to cover some specific INA topics before we release the draft of the INA document to have these MAGs in late this quarter and early next quarter, and for asking for stakeholders' input. Mid-September is the timing that we plan to have the first MAG webinar to cover topics including new candidate resources, resource costs and potential, transmission implication, updates, ELCC service updates for Resolve, and some other topics. And the stakeholders will be invited to submit their comments to us following this MAG. In terms of the exact timing and the content that we cover in this first MAG webinar, we will notify the IRP service list with details regarding the details in August, hopefully the first half of August. This just was a quick update that we wanted to provide to parties interested in the INA process. And at the end of this section, with that, I pass it back to Neil. Thank you.
Thanks, Ali. So closing out here, yeah, that topic there was, just to be clear, not related to the LSE's reliability filing requirements, which has been the focus of this webinar. And probably the main other thing that we commented on in this webinar was, which is not directly applicable to LSE's reliability filing requirements, was the Resolve improvements being made that I think Patrick outlined earlier, related but not affecting LSE filing requirements. Those Resolve improvements will help us when we next do capacity expansion modeling for the later use cases later this IRP cycle. So look, summary of this slide here is that with the postings we made on Friday the 15th, and as notified to the service list yesterday by Ali, LSEs have almost everything they need for their planning. we focused here on the reliability filing requirements. Really, this webinar has been orange around that because these are new to IRP in this cycle. But there are other filing requirements, of course, for LSE's plans not listed here. So just running through this quickly, we had the June 15 ruling formalizing the overall filing requirements, and at that time, staff posted the filing requirements overview to the website. On July 1, staff sent each LSE their final peak demand and behind-the-meter PV forecasts. And then just on Friday, we posted the RDT that we gave a glimpse of earlier, along with an updated user guide. That RDT focuses on the 38 MMT by 2030 portfolio and provided some of the ELCC percentages needed there for LLCs, but with some still pending until we complete the model runs. It also provided the system level marginal reliability need megawatts. On that posting from a few days ago, also had the first iteration of the filing requirements questions and answer document, which will be updated on a rolling basis as we get more questions. And we also posted an updated filing requirements overview. And so what remains is the final RDT with all the marginal ELCCs that LSEs will need. So the rest of the 38 MMT portfolios ELCCs, as well as those for the 30 MMT by 2030 portfolio. And I think just relating that back to the earlier discussion prompted by Nick Papas is that these two sets of ELCCs will actually serve to sort of answer questions about how sensitive are marginal ELCCs to resource mix, because we're providing two sets, one for each portfolio that the LSEs are using for their planning. And just to the final bullet here is that we'll start office hours soon with each group of LSEs to answer questions and generally support their individual plan development. On the final slide, looking beyond filing requirements and to those other reliability use cases, just repeating what Nathan said at the start, that parties can informally comment on what we've talked about today. They won't affect the filing requirements we've just set, but they will inform our further work on reliability come this cycle. And so those comments can be sent by emailing that email address shown here. And we do expect that there'll be also formal opportunities to comment on this work or its subsequent iterations. So with that, I'm handing back to Nathan to close out, and I think noting we've got about 9 or 10 minutes left. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Neil. I think I'll first just do kind of a catch-all, ask for whether there's any remaining questions that haven't been answered yet. I think we've dealt with everything in the Q&A. Ali, there's one for you in there right now. But any folks with hands raised that have, say, more general questions?
Nick, is your hand still raised, I guess?
Not intentionally. Thanks, David.
Okay, that's fine, thanks. Paul Nelson, I think you've already asked, unless you want to ask again.
No, I thought I lowered the hand, so I'm puzzled on working.
Nick, we need to maybe do some homework on our own WebEx software and provide an updated bullet in that housekeeping slide I covered a while ago that gives very clear instructions on how to unraise, because maybe we
Well, I'm looking right here. I see the hand, and if I click on it, it says raise hand. And I just clicked on it, which would be raise hand, not lower hand. So I don't know what's going on.
We can handle reliability, but hand WebEx is too difficult. Doug Karp has a hand up.
Yeah, hi. I suppose you can hear me. So if I understand right, the last ELCCs for like the out years won't be available until the end of the month, which means I think realistically, a lot of us are not going to be able to start our modeling to do our portfolio development until we have those. And so I was wondering if there is any consideration among stakeholders, among folks at Energy Division about pushing back the November 1 deadline to allow more time to do modeling. I realize that probably requires some modification of the decision, but I just sort of canvassing sort of early interest, whether you all had thoughts on that possibility.
Doug, it's a tough one. You've heard me be a bit of a stickler for schedule before.
Yes.
We've definitely considered this, and there's always a trade-off between, process and, actually keeping the schedule. We acknowledge that, it crunches LSEs a bit, and we're sorry for that crunch, but we have been trying to issue the information in bundles so that LSEs could take it on and do their planning. I guess I'd just put the question back to you and maybe other LSEs that share similar concern of, how dependent are you on an exact ELCC to do meaningful parts of your planning? Or, is it fair to assume that a lot of it can be done either with information you'd already have on hand through internal sources or have access to that gets you, quote unquote, in the ballpark, but not necessarily to the exact answer?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I've been chatting with our modeling team some, and the sense that I get is that when the final ELCCs, we'll be in the ballpark before that, but then we're still going to have to do a whole set of new model runs at that point. So I guess a lot of the sort of troubleshooting and development will be can be done without it, but there's still significant concerns about having enough time to get final numbers that are actually accurate given the counting for those resources.
Thanks for raising that, Doug.
Yeah.
Feel free to follow up offline if there's more detail. But
okay, will do. Yeah. Bit of a game of telephone here.
Moving November 1st is a tough ask. I'll be upfront about that.
Okay, cool.
I think that's it, unless Mark Specht had his hand up, but raised it down. Mark, are you there?
Yeah, I did. Maybe I'll just ask anyways. I was gonna ask, because we're moving to marginal ELCC, I just want to make sure I understand. Does that mean we don't have to worry about accounting for diversity benefits anymore? Like diversity benefits are just something you would have to account for in an average ELCC world? Is that correct?
Mark, I might want to push you a little bit on, it almost seems like there's an assumption in there that marginal doesn't. Is that fair in your view?
Yeah, that was implied in the question I was asking there. It seems like we're not accounting for diversity benefits in anything that was presented today. So I guess that's why that assumption was included.
Mark, Aaron might be able to jump in, but I think diversity came up when Aaron was explaining when you have average ELCCs, you do need to allocate the diversity benefits between resource types. But by using marginal, you're directly attributing the contribution of each resource type. But neither approach sort of tells LSE what combination they need to use. They've got to factor that in among the other constraints. But Aaron may have a better way of getting to this.
I can add a little bit there. So yeah, when we calculate marginal ELCCs, we are taking a portfolio of resources and we're taking a given resource class and we're adding a small increment of that to the resource portfolio with all of those other resources in the portfolio. So last in marginal ELCCs inherently capture all of the diversity impacts. So if you have a lot of storage in the portfolio, for instance, that's why you see marginal ELCCs for solar maintaining some value. However, there's no need to allocate the portfolio ELCC based on different diversity or benefits or interactive effects that you try to isolate across resource classes. You only need to do that in an average ELCC approach.
Okay, thank you. That makes sense.
Hands.
Okay. I think we're right at time here. So thanks everybody for spending some time with us, not just to better understand our process and what we're doing here reliability wise, but also through your questions, pushing us both now and I would trust in the future to identify possible improvements, and actually engage in them. And thank you for your input on that. And thank you in advance for what you might provide in the future. Otherwise, we look forward to engaging with all of you again later on this year on other topics. So Ali already described the inputs and assumptions development process that we got a couple questions on at the end there. That's coming later this year, as well as some staff product and kind of conversation about the IRP procurement program that got alluded to once or twice. Otherwise, I think we can say everyone have a good afternoon and thanks for joining.
Thank you.